Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. Have I ever told you about the time we faced the Nguoi Rung? Grandpa's voice was slow, deliberate, as he stared into the distance, the memory seeming to take shape before him. We were all sitting around the fire pit in the backyard, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. My cousins and I loved listening to Grandpa's stories, especially the ones from his time in the war. But this one, we could tell, was different. There was something in his voice, a hint of hesitation, as if this story was one he didn't tell often. It was a long time ago. He began when I was still a young soldier, fresh out of training. They sent us on a mission deep into the Vietnamese jungle, to a place that was said to be cursed. The locals told stories about a creature that lived there, something they called the Nguoi Rung. At the time, we brushed it off as superstition. But looking back, I wish we'd listened more carefully. He leaned back in his chair, eyes reflecting the flames, and we all leaned in closer, eager to hear what came next. The mission started like any other. Our unit was briefed early in the morning 2 days to reach the observation post deep in the jungle, 1 day to gather intel, and then a night to rest before heading back. Simple enough, or so it seemed. We were a group of 5. Myself, Captain Harrison, a solid leader with nerves of steel. Jack, the joker of the group. Mike, our radio operator, who was always a little too serious. And Frank, the muscle, a man of few words but plenty of strength. Before we left base, we heard whispers from the Vietnamese soldiers locals who had grown up hearing about the Nguoi Rung. They warned us, though none too seriously, to be cautious of the jungle at night. They said the creature lurked in the shadows, especially when strangers ventured too deep into its territory. But we laughed it off. Who wouldn't? A Bigfoot-like creature in the middle of a war zone. We had bigger problems to deal with: enemy patrols, snipers, booby traps, not some jungle monster. We packed light, just the essentials: rifles, rations, and gear. The jungle didn't care if you were a soldier or a tourist. It would swallow you whole if you weren't careful. As we began our journey, the air was thick with humidity, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hanging heavy. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the jungle itself was alive, breathing around us. Our first night, we stopped at a small, abandoned outpost, an old French station, left to rot long before the Americans arrived. It wasn't much, just a few crumbling walls and a roof that barely kept the rain out. But it was shelter, and trekking through the dense foliage all day, we were glad to have it. I remember the first night distinctly because it was the last time any of us felt truly safe. As we sat around, sharing stories and lighting a small fire, Jack started to make jokes about the Nguoi Rung, imitating the sound of howling monkeys and rustling bushes. We all laughed, but there was an uneasiness in the air that none of us could quite shake. The jungle is alive, Frank muttered under his breath, staring out into the dark. We all looked at him, surprised. He wasn't the superstitious type, but something about this place was getting to him. He didn't elaborate, just shook his head and went back to cleaning his rifle. That night, as we lay down to sleep, the sounds of the jungle seemed louder than usual. The hum of insects, the distant call of some nocturnal bird, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But there was something else, to something faint, just at the edge of hearing. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite animal. I told myself it was just my imagination. I wasn't the only one, though. In the middle of the night, I heard Captain Harrison stirring. I opened my eyes to see him sitting up, staring out into the darkness, rifle across his lap. "Can't sleep," I whispered, careful not to wake the others. He didn't answer at first, just kept looking out into the jungle. Finally, he spoke, his voice slow. There's something out there, something watching us. Morning came, and with it, a strange sense of relief. Whatever had haunted us in the night seemed to vanish with the rising sun. We packed up quickly and continued deeper into the jungle, the weight of the previous night hanging over us like a shadow. The landscape was unforgiving, dense vines and thick undergrowth made every step a struggle, but there was something else too. The further we went, the more the jungle felt wrong. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a heaviness that settled on our shoulders. The local guides had refused to come this far. The jungle is sacred, they had said. The Nguoi Rung protects it. We had laughed then, but now, with the silence of the jungle pressing in on us, their warnings didn't seem so ridiculous. Around midday, we reached the observation point, an overgrown clearing on a hill overlooking the valley below. From here, we were supposed to gather intel, report on enemy movement, and get out. But something wasn't right. There were no signs of life, no birds, no insects. The jungle, once so full of noise and movement, had gone deathly still. It wasn't long before we started to notice other things too. Strange tracks in the mud, much too large to belong to any animal we knew. Broken branches high up in the trees, as if something massive had passed through recently. And the feeling, that overwhelming sense of being watched, was back, stronger than ever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, we all felt it. We were not alone. Grandpa's story continued, and the fire crackled softly as he stared into it, his voice dropping into a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. We leaned in, eager to hear what came next. We had reached the observation post, but none of us were comfortable. The jungle was too quiet, and when the jungle goes quiet, something's wrong. We tried to push the unease aside. After all, we had a mission to complete. As the day wore on, we began our surveillance, setting up radios and taking turns scanning the valley below for any sign of enemy activity. But everything seemed deserted. We were supposed to find signs of the enemy, but it was like the entire area had been abandoned. The only movement was the slow sway of trees in the breeze. By late afternoon, I could tell something was bothering the others, even though no one said anything outright. We all felt it, that sensation of being watched, like eyes were following our every move from the dense jungle around us. Captain Harrison kept glancing over his shoulder, his jaw clenched tight. Frank, normally the calm and collected one, kept pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath. Even Jack, who could always find a joke to lighten the mood, had gone quiet. It wasn't long before we started hearing things. At first, it was subtle. Rustling in the bushes, branches snapping, low whispers carried on the wind. We tried to rationalize it: wild animals, the wind, anything but what we all secretly feared. But it wasn't long before rational explanations seemed impossible. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the jungle. That's when we saw it, the first real sign that something was wrong. Mike, our radio operator, had gone a little ways into the trees to set up a better signal. He was gone for only a few minutes when we heard him shouting. We rushed over, rifles ready, expecting the worst. But when we found him, he wasn't hurt, just shaken. He pointed to the ground, his face pale. At first, we couldn't see what had spooked him so badly. Then, we looked closer. There, pressed deep into the mud, were footprints. But these weren't any normal footprints. They were huge, too big to belong to any man. The tracks were fresh, leading deeper into the jungle, disappearing into the undergrowth. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at the prints. It wasn't until Captain Harrison spoke that we snapped out of it. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his concern. "Stay close. Don't wander off." That night, we made camp, but none of us were keen on sleeping. We built a small fire, careful not to draw too much attention, and set up a watch rotation. The jungle around us was still deathly quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant snap of a branch. As the hours crept by, we took turns dozing off, each of us trying to shake the uneasy feeling that something or someone was watching us from the shadows. I was on watch when I saw it ... At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, barely audible, but unmistakable. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw movement, just a flicker of motion between the trees. Something was out there, something big. I nudged Captain Harrison awake, whispering urgently. He didn't hesitate, grabbing his rifle and signaling for the others to wake up. We stayed low, I scanning the darkness, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our hearts. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves and the crackle of the fire. But then, out of the darkness, came a sound that chilled us to the bone, a long, mournful howl, echoing through the trees. Frank swore under his breath. What the hell was that? No one had an answer. We just sat there, rifles at the ready, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The howl faded into the night, and the jungle returned to its eerie silence. We stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. But whatever had been out there didn't show itself again. When morning came, the tension didn't lift. The jungle, now bathed in the early light, still felt oppressive, like it was hiding secrets in every shadow. We decided to finish our mission as quickly as possible and get out of there. The sooner we were back at base, the better. But as we packed up camp, we found something that made our blood run cold. The footprints, they were back, but this time, they were closer, much closer. In fact, they circled our entire camp, like whatever had been out there last night had been watching us the whole time. And it hadn't just been watching, it had been right on top of us. Captain Harrison stared at the prints, his face pale. We need to move, now. We didn't waste any time, with our nerves on edge. We hurried through the jungle, eager to put as much distance between us and the mysterious footprints as possible. But the deeper we went, the stranger things got. The jungle around us seemed to change, the trees growing closer together, the air becoming heavier, more oppressive. And then we found it ... a clearing, hidden deep in the jungle. And in the center of that clearing, an old, abandoned enemy outpost, but it didn't look right. It was too quiet, too untouched, as if it had been left behind in a hurry. There were no signs of life, no signs of struggle, just silence. We exchanged uneasy glances, none of us wanting to be the first to say what we were all thinking. Something had driven them out. The fire crackled as Grandpa paused in his story, his weathered hands resting on his knees. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on his face, making his expressions all the more intense. He looked up, and we could feel the weight of the next part of the tale coming. That clearing, he said in a low voice, wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted. We stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the enemy outpost that lay before us. It was small, almost a collection of huts and lean-tos, surrounded by rusted barbed wire and crumbling sandbags. Vines had already started to reclaim the area, creeping up the walls and through the cracks. The silence was deafening. No birds, no wind. Just a thick, heavy stillness that pressed down on us from all sides. Harrison was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spread out. See if there's anything we can use. But don't go too far." Reluctantly, we moved forward, rifles in hand, keeping close to each other. There was something wrong about this place, something unnatural. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that something or someone was just out of sight, waiting for us to let our guard down. Jack and I approached one of the huts, its door hanging half off its hinges. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and decay. Old papers were scattered across the floor, written in Vietnamese. A few rusted weapons lay against the wall, long forgotten. Jack ran his fingers over one of the rifles, then quickly pulled his hand back as if burned. "This place, it gives me the creeps, man," he muttered, his usual humor nowhere to be found. I nodded. I could feel it too. That strange, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into your bones. But we had to keep moving. We had a mission. We found nothing of value in the huts, just remnants of the past. But, as we rejoined the others in the center of the clearing, we noticed something strange. The ground beneath us was uneven, like it had been disturbed recently. I crouched down, brushing away some of the dirt. That's when I saw it. A shallow pit, covered with leaves and dirt. It was filled with bones. Human bones. There were skulls, ribs, leg bones, all tangled together in a haphazard pile. Some of them looked old, bleached white by time, but others looked fresh. I jumped back, my heart racing. "Captain, you need to see this." Harrison rushed over, followed by the rest of the group. His face went pale when he saw the pit. "Jesus, what the hell happened here?" Frank crouched next to the pit, shaking his head. "This doesn't look like the enemy's doing. No burial, no markings. Just dumped here." Jack swallowed hard. "You think this is some kind of execution site? Maybe the VC used it to get rid of prisoners." But something didn't sit right with me. The jungle had a way of making you question everything. And this place felt wrong. Like it wasn't just men who had died here. It felt darker than that, more ancient. I could feel it in my gut. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the clearing, rustling the leaves and sending a chill down my spine. The others must have felt it too, because we all looked up at the same time. That's when we saw them. At first, they were just shadows, dark figures moving between the trees, barely visible in the fading light. But as we watched, the shadows grew darker, more distinct. There were several of them, all tall, looming shapes that seemed to flicker and shift in the twilight. They stood just at the edge of the clearing, watching us, silent, motionless. Frank raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. We were frozen, staring at those figures as they stood there, like sentinels guarding the jungle. Then, one of them moved. It stepped forward, just a few paces, and the light hit it for the first time. It wasn't a man. The creature was covered in coarse, dark fur, its eyes glowing a faint amber in the dim light. It stood onto legs, but hunched over, its long arms hanging almost to the ground. Its face, it was human, but twisted, deformed, with sharp teeth bared in a snarl. Nguoi Rung. The name echoed in my mind. The stories I had heard from the villagers were playing over and over. The jungle spirit, the man-beast. Jack let out a shaky breath. "No way, that's not real, it can't be real." But it was real, and it wasn't alone. The others stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, their glowing eyes fixed on us. There were at least 5 of them now, circling the clearing, closing in. Harrison barked an order. "Back up. Slowly. Don't make any sudden moves." We obeyed, stepping back inch by inch, our eyes never leaving the creatures, but they didn't stop. They kept moving closer, their growls low and menacing, like predators stalking prey. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing tighter, the shadows growing longer. My heart pounded in my chest, my mouth dry. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was survival. Then, without warning, one of the creatures lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, crossing the clearing in a blur of fur and claws. Frank fired, the gunshot echoing through the jungle, but it was too late. The creature was on him, knocking him to the ground with a sickening thud. "Run," Harrison shouted, but we were already moving, sprinting through the trees, our gear forgotten, fear driving us forward. Behind us, we could hear the creatures crashing through the undergrowth, their growls and snarls growing louder. They were fast, too fast. I could hear Jack cursing under his breath, his footsteps pounding beside me as we ran. The jungle whipped past in a blur. branches clawing at our arms and faces, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Not until we were far away from those things. Not until we were safe. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line and into a clearing. Gasping for breath, we collapsed to the ground, our bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. But the creatures didn't follow. The jungle behind us was silent once more, as if the nightmare we had just lived through had never happened. We lay there for a long time, too shaken to speak, our minds reeling from what we had just seen. Frank was gone. We didn't know how many more of us might follow. The fire popped and crackled as Grandpa's voice dropped to an almost inaudible whisper. The dim light barely illuminated his face as he leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the terror he had lived through. We hung on to every word, waiting for the next part of the story. They were on us, no matter how fast we ran, he muttered. There was no escaping them, no escaping the jungle. We lay in the clearing, panting and gasping for breath. Sweat dripped down our faces as the adrenaline slowly drained from our bodies. I glanced at Jack, who was staring blankly at the tree line, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Harrison crouched near us, his rifle ready, eyes scanning the dense forest. What were those things? Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know. None of us did. But the image of those glowing eyes, the twisted faces, and the speed at which they attacked was burned into my mind. My hands still shook, the rifle heavy in my grip. They're not human, Harrison said after a long silence. We need to move before they come back. The forest around us was eerily silent again. No wind, no movement. Just the oppressive feeling of being watched. As we stood up, I could feel the eyes on us. They were out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. We gathered ourselves, checking our gear, trying to make sense of our scattered thoughts. But Frank was gone, and his absence hung over us like a dark cloud. I could still hear his scream echoing in my head, the sound of his body hitting the ground, and the sight of that beast ripping into him. We needed to leave, but there was no safe direction. The jungle was a labyrinth, thick and hostile, with no obvious escape route. And the creatures, those Nguoi Rung, they knew the land better than we did. They were hunters, and we were their prey. Stay close, Harrison ordered, his voice firm but strained. No one falls behind. We moved together, cutting through the dense foliage. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through my body. The jungle felt alive, like it was breathing, closing in on us with every step we took. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Time was meaningless in the jungle. The oppressive heat mixed with the stifling fear made every second stretch into eternity. We tried to keep track of where we were, but the thick canopy blocked out the sun, and soon we were hopelessly lost. Harrison led the way, his eyes darting in every direction, his rifle always at the ready. Jack was close behind me, muttering under his breath about curses and spirits. We all felt it, that primal fear that clawed at your sanity, that made you believe that the very ground beneath you was out to get you. The air grew colder as the light began to fade. The oppressive heat of the jungle was replaced with an unnatural chill, and the shadows around us lengthened. I knew it wasn't just the approaching night. Something was wrong. The jungle itself felt different, like we had wandered into a place that didn't belong in this world. Do you hear that? Jack asked, his voice shaking. At first, I thought he was imagining things, but then I heard it too. A faint, distant sound, like whispering. The kind of sound that sent chills down your spine. It was barely audible, like it was being carried on the wind from far away. But the more we walked, the louder it became. Where is it coming from? I asked. Harrison frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. Everywhere. We continued moving, the whispers growing louder and more disorienting. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding us, pulling us deeper into the jungle. They weren't voices we could understand, just unintelligible murmurs that made your skin crawl. Suddenly, Jack stopped in his tracks, staring at something ahead. I followed his gaze, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the Nguoi Rung, but as I squinted through the dim light, I realized it was human. A man. He was standing perfectly still, dressed in ragged military gear, his face pale and lifeless. His eyes were hollow, empty, as if he was staring right through us. "Who the hell is that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know. None of us did, but something about the man sent waves of dread through my body. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching us with those dead, unseeing eyes. "We need to move," Harrison said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But before we could take a step, the figure disappeared. Not into the trees, not by running. He just vanished, like he had never been there at all. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. "Did you see that?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. "I saw it," I replied, my pulse racing. We didn't wait to figure out what had just happened. We bolted, pushing through the dense underbrush, our breaths coming in short, panic gasps. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker, the shadows darker. The whispers followed us, louder now, more insistent, like a chorus of the damned. But it wasn't just the whispers anymore. There were footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate, matching our pace. I didn't dare look back, but I knew the creatures were there, following us, closing the distance with every second. The jungle was alive with sounds now snapping branches, rustling leaves, and that ever-present, bone-chilling whispering. It felt like the jungle itself was coming for us, like we were trespassers in a place we were never meant to be. We broke into a small clearing, and for a brief moment, the oppressive weight of the jungle lifted, but it didn't last. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling stone structure, ancient and overgrown, like a forgotten relic from a time long past. "We need to get inside," Harrison ordered, his voice tight with fear. We didn't question him. We sprinted toward the structure, desperate for shelter, for any kind of protection from the horrors lurking in the jungle. As we entered the stone building, the whispers stopped, the footsteps ceased, and for the first time since we'd encountered the Nguoi Rung, the jungle was silent. But the silence was worse. It wasn't the silence of safety. It was the silence of something watching, waiting. We could feel it, pressing in from all sides, suffocating us with its presence. "We're not alone in here," Jack whispered, and he was right. Grandpa's voice grew darker as he leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the armrests. The fire crackled softly, the only sound filling the room as we waited in silence for him to continue. "We thought we'd be safe once we got inside that structure," he muttered, his eyes distant, staring into the past. But that silence ... it wasn't normal. It was the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, the kind that makes you realize you're not welcome. Inside the stone structure, the air felt thick and stale. The coldness pressed against our skin like an unwelcome shroud. The room we found ourselves in was small, cramped, with walls covered in moss and vines. Whatever this place had been, it was long abandoned, overtaken by the jungle around it. But it wasn't the decaying building that unnerved us, it was the oppressive feeling of being watched. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. Something was in there with us. Harrison glanced around, his rifle never leaving his hands. Jack stood close to the entrance, his eyes darting back and forth as if expecting something to burst in at any moment. I could see the fear in everyone's faces. "We'll wait here until it's safe," Harrison said, though he didn't sound convinced. His voice was thin, strained, as if he was trying to hold onto some kind of control that was rapidly slipping away. I glanced at the narrow, broken window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes from the jungle staring back at us. But outside, the night had fully fallen, shrouding everything in darkness. The jungle itself seemed to be holding its breath. The minutes dragged by in unbearable silence. Jack muttered something about curses under his breath again, and Harrison shot him a warning look, but nobody reprimanded him this time. The jungle, the whispers, the shadows, it all felt like some terrible nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, a soft creaking sound echoed through the room. We all froze. The sound was subtle, but distinct, like wood bending or something heavy shifting under pressure. It came from deeper within the stone structure, beyond the doorway at the far end of the room. Jack's face paled. What the hell was that? We didn't answer. No one dared to move or even breathe too loudly. The air felt heavy, like the room was suffocating us. Then we heard it again. This time, it was louder, clearer, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing in the darkness beyond that door. Get ready, Harrison hissed, raising his rifle. Jack and I followed suit, gripping our weapons tightly. But my hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it in my ears, almost louder than the footsteps. We stood in silence, waiting. The footsteps came closer, echoing in the empty structure. But no figure emerged from the doorway. No shadow crossed the threshold. The door stood open, a black void leading into nothingness. And yet the footsteps continued, closer, closer. Suddenly, the air grew even colder, biting at my skin. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at Jack, who was breathing heavily, his wide eyes fixed on the door. We're not alone, he whispered ... As if in response, the footsteps stopped abruptly, just beyond the doorway. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound of the steps. It was an unnatural silence, thick with the weight of something unseen. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that was threatening to overtake me. What do we do, Harrison? I whispered. But before he could answer, a new sound filled the room, a low, raspy breath. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but then it grew louder, filling the space around us. Jack stumbled back, his rifle shaking in his hands. No, this can't be happening. The breath was coming from the doorway. But still, nothing appeared. No figure, no shadow. Just that terrible, rasping sound, like something was breathing right next to us, watching us from the darkness. My chest tightened, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but my legs were frozen in place. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, spinning around to face the door. It had closed on its own, trapping us inside the room. The only light came from the narrow window, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. What the hell is going on? Jack shouted, panic rising in his voice. Harrison stepped forward, his face pale but determined. We need to stay calm. Whatever's out there, or in here, it's trying to scare us. It's working, I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. The cold intensified, and then the whispering began again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was all around us, inside the room. Low, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to echo off the walls, swirling around our heads. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry, hostile. Jack backed up against the wall, his wide eyes darting from corner to corner. We need to get out of here. We can't, Harrison replied. We'll be exposed if we leave the structure. Exposed to what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What is out there? Harrison didn't answer. He didn't know. None of us did. But deep down, I knew that whatever was outside wasn't our only problem. The presence inside the stone structure, whatever it was, didn't want us there. It was old, ancient, tied to this jungle in ways we couldn't understand, and it was angry. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling our heads. It was like 1,000 voices speaking at once, each one demanding something we couldn't comprehend. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, reverberating through my skull. Then, all at once, the whispering stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before, pressing down on us like a weight. And that's when we saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, darker than the rest of the shadows. It shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there, watching us, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure. It was humanoid, but its form was twisted, distorted, like it didn't belong in this world. Its eyes, if you could call them, that glowed faintly in the darkness, watching us with a malevolent intelligence. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to tell us that we had trespassed where we didn't belong, and it wasn't going to let us leave without paying a price. "Don't move," Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible, but it was too late. Jack let out a choked cry and stumbled backward, his foot catching on the uneven stone floor. As he fell, his hand knocked over one of our packs, sending a loud clatter echoing through the room. The shadow moved. Grandpa paused, his hand trembling slightly as he took a sip of water. The tension in the room was palpable, as if we were sitting in that abandoned stone structure with him. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the walls, and we all waited in silence for him to continue. "I wish I could tell you that it was just our imaginations," Grandpa said softly, "that maybe the jungle was playing tricks on us. But what we saw, what we felt that night, it was real." The shadow moved faster than any of us could react. It crossed the room in a blink, a black, shapeless form that seemed to dissolve into the air as it reached Jack. His scream echoed in the small room, filled with raw terror, and then silence. Jack hit the floor, limp, his eyes wide open but vacant. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't there anymore either. His body was still breathing, but his mind had gone somewhere else. Somewhere dark. "Jack." I rushed to him, shaking his shoulders, but there was no response. He stared up at the ceiling, unblinking, his mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. His fingers twitched, but there was no life behind his eyes. Harrison pulled me back, his face pale. "Leave him. There's nothing we can do for him." I wanted to argue, to scream that we couldn't just leave him like that. But deep down, I knew Harrison was right. Jack was gone. Whatever had taken him wasn't going to let him come back. We backed away from Jack's still form, keeping our eyes on the shadowy corner of the room, but the figure was gone. The oppressive silence had returned, thicker than ever, but there was no sign of the thing that had taken Jack. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Harrison nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll make a break for it, but we need to stay close together. Whatever that thing is, it's picking us off one by one." We grabbed our packs, keeping our rifles close, and slowly inched toward the door. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, cautiously. The door loomed ahead of us, still shut, as if daring us to leave the safety of the stone walls. When we reached the door, Harrison grabbed the handle and pulled. It creaked open, the jungle air rushing in, cold and damp. The moon had risen high, casting a pale glow through the trees, but the darkness between them was impenetrable. We stepped outside, the weight of the jungle pressing down on us. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel eyes on us from every direction, hidden in the shadows of the trees. "We head north," Harrison whispered, his voice tense. "We're not far from the extraction point. If we move fast, we can make it before dawn." We moved in silence, our boots crunching softly on the jungle floor. The thick canopy overhead blocked most of the moonlight, leaving us in near darkness as we pushed forward. The jungle around us seemed alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. Every sound made me jump: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't the jungle we feared. It was the thing that had taken Jack. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. The trees parted, revealing a patch of moonlight in the center. We stopped, catching our breath, but something about the clearing felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the ground was littered with strange markings, deep, claw-like gouges in the dirt. Harrison crouched down, running his fingers over the marks, his face dark with worry. "This isn't animal," he muttered, his voice low. "It's something else." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the trees. A low, guttural growl, like the sound of a large predator but distorted. Wrong. It was coming from the shadows just beyond the clearing. We raised our rifles, backing away slowly, but the growl grew louder, closer. The trees around us seemed to shift, as if something massive was moving through them. Suddenly, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, taller than any man, covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, burning with an unnatural light. Its limbs were long and twisted, more beast than human, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. The Nguoi Rung, the forest spirit. The villagers had spoken of it in hushed tones, warning us never to wander too deep into the jungle. They said it was a guardian, a protector of the land, but also a vengeful spirit that preyed on those who trespassed where they didn't belong, and we had trespassed. Harrison fired first, the shot echoing through the clearing, but the bullet passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The thing didn't flinch, didn't slow. It just kept moving toward us, its glowing eyes locked on mine. I fired, emptying my clip, but the bullets did nothing. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its twisted limbs reaching out as it closed the distance between us. "We need to run," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature was on us in seconds, its clawed hands swiping through the air. Harrison screamed as it grabbed him, lifting him off the ground like a ragdoll. His body convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head as the creature's claws sank into his chest. I turned and ran, not looking back, not thinking. The jungle blurred around me as I stumbled through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far away from that thing as I could get. I don't remember how long I ran. It felt like hours, maybe days. But eventually, I stumbled out of the jungle, collapsing in a heap on the side of the road. The extraction team found me there the next morning, alone, delirious with fear and exhaustion. They never found Harrison or Jack, or whatever that thing was, but I never went back to that jungle, and I never spoke of it again, until now. Grandpa's voice trailed off, and the room was silent once more. We sat in stunned silence, the weight of his story hanging in the air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the walls. Did anyone believe you?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. Grandpa smiled faintly, his eyes tired. "No, they thought it was just the jungle, that maybe the war had gotten to me, or the heat. But I know what I saw, and I know that thing is still out there, watching, waiting." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "So, if you ever find yourself deep in the jungles of Vietnam, stay out of the dark, and don't listen to the whispers." If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.